They buried her 3 times. The first burial was official, May 17, 1839, in the segregated corner of Woodlawn Cemetery where the help were laid to rest. The second was in the family plot at Bellewood Manor, 11 days later, after the Whitmore family insisted she deserved better. The third burial, the one that wasn't recorded in any ledger or mentioned in any newspaper, happened in the root cellar beneath the manor's kitchen, and she was still breathing when they sealed the door. Her name was Sarah Cole, and she was 16 years old when the Whitmores hired her as a housemaid. Her brother Thomas was 12, small for his age, with careful hands and a way of moving through spaces that made people forget he was there. Both of them had been born into servitude on the Bellewood estate, children of the head housekeeper, and both were considered fortunate by the standards of 1830s Mississippi. The Whitmores, after all, were refined people. Educated. They had paintings from Europe and books in 3 languages, and Mrs. Whitmore herself had studied at a women's academy in Charleston before marrying into one of the wealthiest families in Natchez. They prided themselves on treating their staff with dignity. But you have to understand something about Bellewood Manor. The house was built in 1821 by Colonel Marcus Whitmore, who made his fortune in cotton and riverboat trade. The structure itself was magnificent, 3 stories of white-columned glory overlooking the Mississippi River, with imported marble floors and crystal chandeliers that caught the afternoon light and scattered it across walls papered in silk from France. Everyone who visited commented on its beauty. No one commented on the architecture beneath the architecture. The network of narrow servants, corridors that ran through the walls like veins, or the unusually deep cellar that extended far beyond what any root storage required. Or the fact that the manor's foundation was built not on solid ground but on filled earth, as if something had been excavated and then covered over before construction began. Thomas Cole noticed these things. He was the kind of child who observed, who listened at doorways, not out of malice, but because information was survival. He watched how Mr. Whitmore's cousin James visited from Charleston every spring and stayed in the guest room above the kitchen, where sounds carried through the heating vents. He noticed how Sarah's demeanor changed after James Whitmore arrived for his annual visit in April of 1839, how she began moving differently, more carefully, as if her body had become something fragile she had to protect. She told Thomas about the baby on May 3rd, in the kitchen after the family had retired for the evening. She was crying, but quietly, the way people cry when they've learned that loud grief brings punishment. Thomas was too young to fully understand what she was telling him, but old enough to understand the fear in her voice when she explained that James Whitmore had promised to marry her, had promised to take her away from Mississippi to Charleston, where things were different, where she could be free. James Whitmore left Bellewood on May 5th, 2 days after Sarah's confession. He never said goodbye to her. Thomas watched from the servants' entrance as James climbed into his carriage, and he saw something in the man's face, a kind of satisfied finality, like someone who had completed a transaction. Mrs. Whitmore stood on the portico and waved, her silk morning dress catching the breeze. She was smiling. Thomas remembered thinking that her smile looked painted on, like the smile on the doll in the nursery that nobody played with anymore. Sarah took ill on May 9th. At first it seemed like a fever, the kind that swept through the staff quarters every summer when the heat rose from the river valley and settled over the estate like a wet blanket. The Whitmores' physician, Dr. Cornelius Hunt, examined her and the servants' wing and prescribed bed rest and laudanum for the pain. Thomas sat with her when his chores allowed, bringing her water and cold compresses, watching her skin take on a gray pallor that reminded him of ash. By May 14th, she was screaming. Not constantly, but in waves that came and went with a rhythm that seemed almost calculated. The screams would start in the evening, around the time the family sat down to dinner, and they would continue until midnight, then stop abruptly, as if cut by a knife. Thomas learned later that this was when Dr. Hunt administered the laudanum, heavy doses that dragged Sarah down into unconsciousness. But during those hours of screaming, she said things. She begged James to come back. She cried about the baby. And she said other things, too, things that made the other servants exchange glances and hurry away. She talked about the cellar. About how many? About the children who never grew up. On May 16th, Mrs. Whitmore herself came to the servants' wing, an unprecedented visit. She swept into the room where Sarah lay dying, her expensive perfume clashing with the smell of sickness and sweat, and she spoke to Sarah in a voice that Thomas could hear from the hallway where he pressed himself against the wall. Mrs. Whitmore's tone was kind, almost motherly. She told Sarah that everything would be taken care of, that the family would see to it, that she received proper burial, that her mother would be compensated for the loss. She held Sarah's hand. Thomas saw this through the crack in the door. Mrs. Whitmore's pale fingers against his sister's dark skin, and the way Mrs. Whitmore's thumb moved in small circles, a gesture that might have been comforting, if not for the coldness in her eyes. Sarah died the next morning. Official cause of death, as recorded by Dr. Hunt, fever of unknown origin, possibly related to consumption. Thomas was allowed to sit with the body for an hour before they took her away. He held her hand the way Mrs. Whitmore had, and he noticed that Sarah's fingernails were broken, the skin beneath them dark with something that looked like dirt. Her fingers were bent slightly, as if she had been clawing at something. The funeral was small. Thomas's mother, Margaret Cole, stood beside the grave with her face like stone. A few other servants attended, heads bowed, speaking in whispers. Reverend Michaels from the Baptist Church said words about God's mercy and eternal rest. They lowered Sarah's coffin into the ground, and Thomas watched the red Mississippi clay swallow his sister. 11 days later, on May 28th, Mrs. Whitmore announced that the family had decided to honor Sarah's service by having her reburied in the family plot. This was extraordinary. Unheard of, really. But Mrs. Whitmore explained to the assembled staff that Sarah had been like family, and that in death, all souls were equal before God. Thomas's mother wept with what everyone assumed was gratitude. They exhumed Sarah's coffin and moved it to the elevated section of Bellewood's grounds, where generations of Whitmores rested beneath marble angels and granite crosses. A new headstone was commissioned, carved limestone with Sarah's name and dates, and the words, "Faithful servant, beloved child of God." Thomas attended this second funeral, too. He was the only one who noticed that the coffin seemed lighter when they carried it. He was the only one who saw Mr. Whitmore and Dr. Hunt exchange a glance when the Reverend spoke about resurrection and eternal life. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. The heat was oppressive, thick as wool, and the small room he shared with 2 other servant boys felt like a tomb. He rose just after midnight and walked through the manor the way he'd learned to do, using the servants, passages, moving in the spaces between the family's world and his own. He wasn't sure what he was looking for until he found himself at the top of the cellar stairs. The cellar door was locked, but Thomas had learned to pick the simple household locks years ago. It was a survival skill, a way to retrieve items the family needed without waking anyone, or to access the pantry when hunger became unbearable between mealtimes. The lock clicked open, and Thomas descended into the darkness. The cellar was divided into sections. The front area held the usual things: shelves of preserved vegetables, racks of wine, barrels of salted meat. But there was a door at the back, one that was usually locked, and that Thomas had always assumed led to additional storage. Tonight, this door stood slightly ajar. What Thomas found in that back room would have been incomprehensible to most 12-year-old children. But Thomas had lived his entire life learning to see things others missed, to understand the unspoken, to piece together truth from fragments. He stood in the doorway with a candle in his hand and let the light fall across what had been hidden. There were 8 beds arranged in 2 rows, medical beds, with leather restraints hanging loose from the frames. Shelves lined the walls, filled with glass jars containing specimens, things preserved in fluid that Thomas couldn't identify but that made his stomach turn. There was a desk covered in papers, journals filled with handwriting in a script he recognized as Dr. Hunt's. And at the far end of the room, there was a table, the kind Thomas had seen in Dr. Hunt's medical office, with channels carved into its surface and drains at the corners. But what made Thomas's breath stop in his chest was the wall behind the table. Someone had carved marks into the stone, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Tallies. And beside the tallies, names had been scratched into the rock with what must have been a nail or piece of metal, crude letters that spelled out words like please and mercy and mother. Thomas took one of Dr. Hunt's journals from the desk. His reading skills were basic, taught by Sarah, who had learned from Mrs. Rees. Whitmore's daughters discarded primers, but he could make out enough. The journal entries were dated going back to 1823, just 2 years after the manor's construction. They described experiments. Procedures. The doctor's tone was clinical, detached, as if he were documenting botanical observations rather than what Thomas was beginning to understand had been done to human beings. One entry from March 1824 described an attempt to, quote, prolong gestation beyond natural term to study developmental effects on maternal and fetal tissue. Another from September 1827 detailed controlled introduction of pathogenic agents to observe immune response in pregnant subjects. A third, from January 1831, discussed the necessity of maintaining viable specimens in various stages of development for comparative analysis. The names in the margins weren't names Thomas recognized, but the descriptions matched servants who had disappeared over the years, girls who had supposedly run away, women who had died in childbirth. Thomas counted 19 entries that specifically mentioned pregnancies and their outcomes. None of the outcomes involved living children. Sarah's name appeared in the final entries, dated from April through May of 1839. The last entry, written in Dr. Hunt's precise hand, was dated May 16th, the day before Sarah's recorded death. It read, "Subject has become problematic, vocalizations increasingly specific and potentially compromising. Mrs. W. has approved final disposal. Specimen preservation to continue as per standard protocol. Family burial to provide necessary cover for extraction and study completion." Thomas closed the journal. His hands were shaking so badly that candlelight jumped and flickered across the walls, making the shadow of the medical table seem to writhe. He understood now. Sarah hadn't died from fever. She had died from whatever Dr. Hunt had done to her, whatever experiments he had conducted on her pregnant body. And the reburial in the family plot hadn't been an honor. It had been theater, a performance to demonstrate the Whitmores' magnanimity while hiding the fact that Sarah's body had never left this cellar. The root cellar, that's what the servants called this space. But it had never been about storing vegetables. It had been about storing something else entirely, and about conducting research that couldn't be conducted anywhere the world might see. Thomas replaced the journal and backed out of the room. He pulled the door closed, climbed the stairs, and locked the cellar entrance behind him. He returned to his bed and lay awake until dawn, understanding that he now possessed knowledge that would get him killed if anyone knew he had it. But Thomas Cole, 12 years old, small for his age, easily overlooked and underestimated, made a decision in those dark hours. He decided that he would survive. He would grow. And when the time came, when he was old enough and strong enough and positioned correctly, he would make every person responsible for Sarah's death understand what they had taken from him. You have to understand the patience this required. Thomas was a child living in a world where he had no power, no resources, no allies who could challenge the Whitmore family's authority. The Whitmores owned everything: the land, the businesses, the politicians, the law itself in Natchez. They were friends with the governor. Marcus Whitmore's brother sat on the state Supreme Court. To accuse them would be suicide. To act against them overtly would result in Thomas's own death, probably blamed on some tragic accident or sudden illness, and nothing would change. The experiments would continue. Other girls would die. The cellar would keep its secrets. So Thomas did what the powerless do when they seek power. He made himself indispensable. He learned everything he could about the family's operations. He studied Marcus Whitmore's business dealings, memorizing names and numbers and the patterns of trade that made the family's fortune. He taught himself proper English by secretly reading books from the manor's library, returning them before dawn, so no one knew they'd been borrowed. He learned to write in several hands, practicing Marcus Whitmore's signature until he could forge it perfectly. He learned which servants could be trusted, and which reported to Mrs. Whitmore about the others. Activities. He learned that Dr. Hunt visited the cellar every Tuesday and Thursday evening, and that Mrs. Whitmore accompanied him on the first Thursday of each month. Thomas was 15 when he learned about the others. It was September of 1842, and a new maid had been hired, a girl named Patience from a plantation upriver. Patience was 14, pretty, and foolish enough to catch James Whitmore's attention when he arrived for his autumn visit. Thomas watched the same pattern unfold. the attention, the promises, the private meetings in the library after the family retired. And then, in November, Patience's whispered confession to another maid that she thought she might be pregnant. Thomas made his first move. He waited until James was alone in the study, reviewing shipping manifests, and he entered the room carrying a tea service that Mrs. Whitmore hadn't requested. James barely glanced at him. Thomas set down the tray, and as he did, he spoke in a voice just above a whisper. "My sister Sarah sends her regards from the cellar, Mr. Whitmore." James's head snapped up. His face went through a progression of emotions: confusion, recognition, fear, and, finally, cold calculation. "I don't know what you're talking about, boy." "Yes, you do." Thomas kept his voice steady, though his heart was hammering against his ribs. "And if anything happens to Patience, if she suddenly takes ill with a mysterious fever, everyone in this house and half of Natchez will know exactly what happens in the root cellar beneath this fine manor. I've written it all down. Dr. Hunt's journals. The names. The dates. I've made copies and given them to people with instructions to deliver them to the newspaper and the federal marshal if I die or disappear. This was a lie." Thomas had no copies and no allies positioned to expose the truth. But James Whitmore didn't know that, and the fear in his eyes told Thomas that the man believed him. "What do you want?" James's voice was tight. "Patience leaves this house alive and unharmed. You arrange employment for her at your Charleston residence, with double the wages she makes here, and you never touch her again. You make this happen by the end of the week, or I start distributing my letters." James Whitmore stared at Thomas for a long moment, and Thomas saw something calculating behind the fear, an assessment of risk and cost. Finally, James nodded. "Consider it done." Patience left for Charleston on December 2nd, 1842, with a letter of reference from Mrs. Whitmore herself and money for the journey. Thomas never saw her again, but he received a letter from her 3 years later, telling him she had married a freedman who owned a carpentry business, that she had 2 children, that she was happy. The letter was hidden in a shipment of supplies from Charleston, delivered by a merchant who knew how to keep secrets for the right price. But saving one girl wasn't enough. Thomas knew that Dr. Hunt's experiments continued. He began keeping his own journal, documenting everything he observed. He noted when new servants were hired, especially young women. He tracked drive, Hunt's visits to the cellar. He documented shipments that arrived at night, crates that were carried directly to the cellar entrance without being logged in the household inventory. He watched and waited and planned. Thomas was 17 when he discovered the network. It started with a delivery in March of 1844. Medical supplies addressed to Dr. Hunt, but shipped from a pharmaceutical company in New Orleans. Thomas intercepted the manifest, memorized the company name, and began researching. This was difficult for someone in his position, but Thomas had learned that merchants gossiped as much as servants, and he had made himself useful to the traders who supplied Bellewood Manor. He ran errands. He delivered messages. He asked careful questions. What he learned was this: the pharmaceutical company in New Orleans supplied 7 other locations in Mississippi, Louisiana, and Alabama. All of them were private estates or sanitariums. All of them were owned by families connected to the Whitmores through marriage, business partnerships, or social networks. And all of them, according to the carefully worded descriptions in medical journals that Thomas found in Dr. Hunt's office, were conducting, quote, into maternal health and fetal development. The Whitmores weren't alone. They were part of something larger, a network of wealthy families using their power and resources to conduct medical experiments that no legitimate institution would allow. They were using servants, slaves, and poor women as subjects, women who could disappear without questions being asked, whose deaths could be attributed to natural causes, whose bodies could be disposed of without investigation. Thomas documented all of it. He stole pages from Dr. Hunt's journals when he could, replacing them with blank sheets that wouldn't be noticed until someone read through the entire volume. He copied names and addresses. He created a map of the network, marking each location and noting the families involved. And he began to understand something that made his blood run cold. The experiments weren't random. They had a purpose. Dr. Hunt's journals discussed attempts to extend viable gestation, to manipulate developmental processes, to understand the mechanisms of inheritance and trait expression. In one entry from 1838, Dr. Hunt wrote about a colleague in Louisiana who claimed to have kept a woman pregnant for 18 months through careful application of experimental compounds, resulting in a child with remarkable physical and cognitive developments, though long-term viability remains uncertain. They were trying to create something, children with specific characteristics perhaps, or they were trying to understand human development at a level that would give them power over life itself. Thomas couldn't be certain of their ultimate goal, but he understood that the women who died in pursuit of this knowledge were considered expendable. They were resources, raw materials, no different than the cotton that made the Whitmores rich or the Mississippi soil that fed their crops. Thomas was 19 when his mother died. Margaret Cole passed in her sleep peacefully, according to the doctor who examined her, though Thomas suspected poison. She had been asking questions about Sarah, something she'd avoided for years, as if grief had finally overcome survival instinct. 2 weeks before her death, she'd told Thomas she wanted to see where Sarah was really buried. She said she'd had dreams where Sarah was calling to her from beneath the house. Thomas buried his mother in the segregated section of Woodlawn Cemetery, the same place Sarah had first been laid to rest. He stood over the grave and made a promise. He would end this, not just for Sarah, not just for his mother, but for all the women who had been used and discarded by people who believed their wealth and power placed them above moral law. But revenge requires resources, and Thomas had none. He was 20 years old, officially the property of the Whitmore estate, with no legal standing and no means of leaving Natchez without being hunted down as a runaway. So he did something desperate. He went to Marcus Whitmore and asked to be freed. This was audacious to the point of insanity. Slaves didn't ask for freedom in Mississippi in 1846. They waited to be granted it, usually upon their owner's death, or they ran and risked everything. But Thomas had studied Marcus Whitmore for years, and he knew the man's weaknesses. Marcus prided himself on his progressiveness, his education, his difference from the crude plantation owners who treated their slaves as mere animals. Marcus liked to think of himself as enlightened. Thomas approached him in the study on a Tuesday afternoon when Marcus was alone with his account books and his imported brandy. Thomas made his request formally, respectfully, and he offered something in return. He told Marcus he wanted to start a business in Natchez, a respectable business that would employ other freedmen and demonstrate the success of Marcus's enlightened management style. He said he would publicly credit the Whitmore family with his success, that he would be living proof of their benevolence. Marcus was intrigued. The abolitionist movement was gaining strength, and Marcus had enemies who called him a hypocrite for claiming enlightenment while profiting from slavery. A freed slave who succeeded and sang the Whitmores, praises would be valuable. Marcus agreed, but with conditions. Thomas would be freed, but he would sign a contract requiring him to remain in Natchez for 10 years, to give the Whitmores first option on any business dealings, and to never speak negatively about the family. If he violated these terms, he would be returned to bondage. Thomas agreed. The manumission papers were drawn up and filed with the county clerk on May 17, 1846, exactly 7 years after Sarah's recorded death. Thomas chose the date deliberately. It was the first act of his revenge, claiming ownership of the day his sister died. With his freedom, Thomas began building his plan. He started a freight business, hauling goods between Natchez and New Orleans. It was modest at first, 1 wagon and a mule, but Thomas was intelligent and hard-working, and he had something else. He had information. He knew which merchants cheated on their taxes, which families had secret debts, which businesses were fronts for illegal activities. He'd learned all of this during his years of observation at Bellewood Manor, and now he used it. Not through blackmail, exactly, but through strategic positioning. He offered favorable rates to people who owed him favors. He made himself useful to people who had power. Within 3 years, Thomas owned 4 wagons and employed 8 men. He was respected in the colored business community and tolerated by white merchants who appreciated his efficiency and discretion. He rented a small house near the river and lived simply, saving almost every penny he earned. People thought he was building capital for expansion. They were wrong. He was building resources for war. Thomas was 24 when he made his first real move against the Whitmores. It started with a fire. The Whitmore cotton warehouse on Silver Street burned to the ground on July 3, 1850. The fire was ruled accidental, blamed on a careless smoker, or perhaps lightning from the thunderstorm that had passed through that afternoon. But Thomas had been watching the warehouse for weeks, had studied the patterns of the guards, had identified the storage areas where oiled rags and volatile chemicals were kept. He had waited for the right conditions: dry weather despite the heat, wind from the river, and the distraction of Independence Day preparations. He had entered through a loading dock that he knew from his freight business was poorly secured, and he had started a fire that would look natural. The warehouse contained 3 months of stored cotton, representing nearly a quarter of the Whitmores' annual revenue. The loss was devastating. Marcus Whitmore aged a decade in the weeks following the fire. He sold off assets to cover immediate debts, closed a factory in Vicksburg, laid off workers. The family's social standing remained intact. They were still Whitmores, still powerful, but the foundation had been weakened. Thomas didn't celebrate. This was just the beginning. Over the next 2 years, he orchestrated a campaign of careful destruction. A steamboat carrying Whitmore goods sank in the Mississippi, its hull mysteriously breached. A land deal fell through when documents went missing from a lawyer's office. A business partner died suddenly, and his widow sold her share of a joint venture to Thomas's proxy at a fraction of its value. Each incident could be explained as bad luck or natural disaster or human error, but together they formed a pattern of decay, the slow collapse of the Whitmore empire. Marcus Whitmore died in 1852, heart failure brought on by stress and probably by the poison that Thomas had been adding to the brandy supply that was delivered monthly to Bellewood Manor. With Marcus gone, James Whitmore inherited control of the family's remaining assets. James was less intelligent than his father and more paranoid. He suspected that the family's misfortunes weren't coincidental, but he couldn't identify the source. He hired investigators, questioned employees, installed new locks and guards, but he didn't suspect Thomas Cole, the successful freedman who had always been respectful, who had publicly credited the Whitmore family with his success, who occasionally did business with Whitmore-affiliated companies, and always conducted himself with perfect propriety. But James should have suspected, because Thomas hadn't forgotten that conversation in 1842, and he hadn't forgotten what James had done to Sarah. Thomas had been patient, because patience was necessary. But now, that patience was ending. Mrs. Elizabeth Whitmore died in 1853. She was found in her bedroom, apparently the victim of a stroke. Only Dr. Cornelius Hunt knew the truth, that her symptoms didn't match stroke pathology, that the petechial hemorrhaging in her eyes suggested suffocation, that the position of her body indicated struggle. But Dr. Hunt kept silent, because Dr. Hunt had his own secrets to protect, and because he received a letter the day after Mrs. Whitmore's death, a letter containing excerpts from his own journals, along with a simple message: "Say nothing, or everyone will know what you've done." Dr. Hunt never discovered who sent the letter. He destroyed his journals, all of them, burning them in his office fireplace over the course of a single night. He closed and locked the examination room in the cellar beneath Bellewood Manor, though he couldn't bring himself to destroy it. The specimens remained in their jars. The medical equipment remained on its shelves. The tally marks and scratched prayers remained on the stone walls. Some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed. James Whitmore fled Natchez in 1854. He sold Bellewood Manor to a family from Virginia and moved to Charleston, where he thought he would be safe, where he could rebuild what his father had lost, where the ghost of a pregnant servant girl wouldn't follow him. He was wrong on all counts. But that's another part of the story, and we'll come back to it. Thomas bought Bellewood Manor in 1856, using money from his shipping business and loans from merchants who owed him favors. The purchase price was suspiciously low. The Virginia family had lived in the house for only 2 years before deciding they wanted to return to Richmond, something about the house not agreeing with them, about noises in the night and a smell they couldn't trace, about servants who refused to work there after dark. Thomas paid cash and took possession on May 17, 1856, 17 years to the day after Sarah's recorded death. The first thing Thomas did after taking ownership was go to the cellar. He brought tools, lanterns, and 2 men he trusted, freedmen who had worked for him for years and who knew how to keep silent about what they saw. Together they opened the sealed examination room. The smell hit them first, decay and chemical preservation and something else, something organic that had gone wrong. The jars on the shelves contained things that Thomas forced himself to examine, specimens in various stages of development, labeled with dates and clinical descriptions. He found Sarah's name on one jar. He didn't look at the contents. He couldn't. He had the men take all the jars outside and bury them in the woods beyond the property line, in graves marked with river stones. But before they destroyed everything, Thomas documented it. He sketched the room's layout. He copied the names scratched into the walls, 19 names that matched 19 women who had died or disappeared from the Bellewood estate between 1823 and 1839. He photographed the medical equipment using a camera he'd purchased specifically for this purpose, the new daguerreotype process that could capture images in permanent silver. He created a record of what had happened in this cellar, a record that could never be dismissed as the ramblings of a vengeful former slave. Then Thomas sealed the room, not with a locked door this time, but with brick and mortar. He had the men wall off the entire back section of the cellar, creating a barrier that looked like original construction. He told them it was for structural reasons, that the back area was unstable and might collapse. They believed him because Thomas had never given them reason to doubt his word. They finished the work and never spoke of what they'd seen. Thomas lived in Bellewood Manor for 3 years. He hosted dinner parties and invited the families who had once socialized with the Whitmores. He was the model of respectable success. A freedman who had risen through hard work and good character, proof that the old system was changing. He donated to churches and schools. He employed dozens of people, both colored and white, in his expanding business empire. He became wealthy, truly wealthy, the kind of wealth that bought influence and respect even in Mississippi in the late 1850s. But late at night, Thomas would go down to the cellar and stand before the brick wall that sealed off the examination room. He would place his hand against the cold brick and tell Sarah what he'd done, what he was planning to do, how many of them he'd made pay for what they'd done to her. Sometimes he thought he could hear her voice through the wall, a whisper that might have been his imagination, or might have been something else, something that remained in the place where she'd died. The network still existed. Thomas had documented 8 locations, and despite the Whitmores' fall, the other families continued their experiments. Thomas had evidence of this, letters intercepted from Dr. Hunt's correspondence before the doctor's death in 1855, a death that was ruled suicide, but that Thomas knew better. The doctor had hanged himself in his office, but only after receiving a final letter reminding him of everything he'd done, every woman he'd killed in pursuit of knowledge that had no moral right to exist. Thomas began targeting the network systematically. The Beaumont family in Louisiana suffered a series of financial disasters that forced them to sell their estate. The Harrisons in Alabama lost 3 sons to accidents that could have been avoided if certain safety measures hadn't mysteriously failed. The Caldwells in Mississippi found themselves facing criminal charges for fraud, charges based on evidence that appeared anonymously on a judge's desk. Each family that fell opened doors to the next. Thomas acquired properties, purchased businesses, gained access to documents and secrets. He built a network of his own, freedmen and sympathetic whites who believed in justice even when the law didn't provide it. He never told them the full story, never revealed what had happened in the cellars of those great houses, but he gave them pieces, enough to motivate them, enough to make them understand they were fighting against something that deserved destruction. By 1859, Thomas had dismantled 6 of the 8 locations he'd originally identified. The families still existed, but their power was broken, their wealth scattered, their secrets locked away, as Thomas had locked away the examination room beneath Bellewood Manor. 2 locations remained. One was a sanitarium in Louisiana run by Dr. Alphonse Marchand, a colleague of Dr. Reege, Hunt's, who had corresponded about experimental techniques. The other was James Whitmore's residence in Charleston. Thomas went to Charleston in the spring of 1860. He traveled under a false name, posing as a merchant interested in establishing trade relationships with South Carolina businesses. He rented rooms in a boarding house near the waterfront and began observing James Whitmore's movements. James had rebuilt some of his fortune through cotton speculation and investments in railroad companies. He lived in a townhouse on Queen Street, elegant but modest compared to Bellewood Manor's grandeur. He had married a Charleston woman from a respectable family, and they had 3 children. Thomas watched the family for weeks, learning their routines, identifying their vulnerabilities. He saw James leaving the house each morning, walking to his office with the confidence of a man who believed he'd escaped his past. He saw the children playing in the garden, innocent of their father's crimes, and he struggled with a question that had haunted him since he began his campaign of revenge. How far should justice extend? Did James's children deserve to suffer for their father's sins? Sarah would have said no. Sarah had been kind, forgiving, the sort of person who believed redemption was possible for everyone. But Sarah was dead, murdered by the man who now lived in comfort with his family. And Thomas wasn't sure that Sarah's kindness was wisdom or simply the habit of someone who had never been given the power to demand justice. Thomas decided on the middle path. He would destroy James Whitmore, but he would spare the family. On June 15, 1860, Thomas arranged for documents to be delivered to 3 newspapers in Charleston, documents that detailed James Whitmore's involvement in his father's business practices, including evidence of fraud, embezzlement, and criminal conspiracy. The documents didn't mention the experiments or the murdered women. Thomas knew those claims would be dismissed or covered up, but they provided sufficient evidence of financial crimes to ruin James's reputation and trigger legal prosecution. The scandal broke within days. James was arrested, his assets frozen, his family's social standing destroyed. The trial lasted 3 months and ended with a conviction on multiple counts of fraud. James Whitmore was sentenced to 15 years in the state penitentiary. His wife divorced him. His children were raised by her family, who took her maiden name and forbade any mention of the Whitmore lineage. James Whitmore died in prison in 1863 during a cholera outbreak that swept through the facility. Official records listed the cause of death as disease, but a guard who was present later testified that James had been murdered by other inmates, stabbed repeatedly in the prison yard. The guard's testimony was never officially recorded. Thomas had paid him well to ensure it wouldn't be. That left Dr. Marchand's sanitarium in Louisiana. Thomas was 40 years old now, his hair turning gray, his body showing the wear of a life spent in constant calculation and careful violence. The war between the states had begun, throwing the entire South into chaos, and in that chaos, Thomas found opportunity. He enlisted in the Union Army, not as a soldier but as a civilian scout and supplier, using his shipping business to move materials for federal forces while simultaneously gathering intelligence about Confederate operations. This position gave Thomas access to military resources and, more importantly, military authority. In March of 1863, Thomas led a small force of Union soldiers to Dr. Marchand's sanitarium outside Baton Rouge. The raid was officially described as targeting a suspected Confederate supply depot. What they actually found was the examination rooms, the preserved specimens, the journals documenting 30 years of experiments on enslaved women. Dr. Marchand was arrested and charged with crimes against humanity, a designation that didn't formally exist, but that the Union commander used anyway, so horrified was he by what they discovered. Marchand was held for trial, but he died before proceedings began, found hanging in his cell in an echo of Dr. Hunt's death. Unlike Hunt, Marchand left a note. It read, "The work was necessary. They will understand one day. We were close to something. So close." Thomas burned the sanitarium to the ground. He didn't seek permission or wait for orders. He simply gathered the kerosene, soaked the building, and lit the match. The soldiers who had seen what was inside didn't stop him. They helped. Together they watched the building burn, the flames consuming the examination tables and the leather restraints and the jars filled with nightmares. The fire burned for 3 days, so intense that the ground itself seemed to smolder, and when it was finally extinguished, nothing remained but ash and the memory of what had been done there. Thomas returned to Natchez in 1864. The war was ending, the South collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions, and Thomas should have felt victorious. He had destroyed the network. He had made every person responsible for Sarah's death pay for what they'd done. The Whitmores were ruined. Dr. Hunt was dead. Dr. Marchand was dead. The examination rooms were sealed or burned. Justice, by any reasonable measure, had been served. But Thomas found no peace. He walked through Bellewood Manor, through rooms that should have felt like victory, but instead felt hollow. He stood in the cellar before the brick wall that sealed off the examination room and realized that revenge, no matter how complete, couldn't bring Sarah back. It couldn't undo what had been done to her. It couldn't erase the tally marks on the stone walls or the names scratched in desperate prayer. It couldn't restore the lives of the 19 women who had died in that room, or the countless others who had died in the network's other locations. Thomas was 42 years old, and he understood, finally, that revenge was not the same as healing. It was a debt paid, a balance settled, but it left the person paying it empty. He had spent 3 decades pursuing justice for his sister, and in that pursuit he had become something she never would have recognized. He had killed, directly and indirectly. He had ruined families, destroyed lives, used the same ruthless calculation that the Whitmores had used. He had become, in some fundamental way, the thing he'd fought against. This realization should have destroyed Thomas. It should have sent him spiraling into guilt and self-loathing. But Thomas Cole had survived too much to be destroyed by philosophy. Instead, he made a different choice. He decided to spend what remained of his life trying to build something rather than destroy. Thomas converted Bellewood Manor into a school. Not immediately. The process took years, but by 1868 the building that had once housed experiments on enslaved women became an institution dedicated to educating freed slaves and their children. Thomas funded the school with his shipping fortune, which had grown substantially during the war years. He hired teachers, both colored and white, who believed in the radical notion that all children deserved education regardless of their skin color or the circumstances of their birth. The school faced opposition. White supremacist groups threatened violence. Former Confederate sympathizers tried to have it shut down through legal challenges. Someone, Thomas never discovered who, tried to burn it down in 1870, though the fire was caught before it could spread. But Thomas had learned patience during his years of revenge, and he applied that same patience to building something that could last. The Bellewood Academy, as it came to be known, operated for 37 years. It educated over 2,000 students during that time, teaching them reading, mathematics, history, and trades that would allow them to support themselves in a world that was slowly, painfully changing. Many of those students went on to become teachers themselves, spreading education through Mississippi and beyond. Some became business owners, doctors, lawyers, living proof that the supposed hierarchy of races was fiction supported only by violence and institutional power. Thomas never married. He lived in a small apartment above the school's library, surrounded by books that he read voraciously, trying to understand the world that had created the horrors he'd witnessed. He learned philosophy, science, history, law. He read about other societies, other times, trying to find evidence that humanity was capable of something better than what he'd seen in the cellars beneath great houses. He found that evidence in small places, in the students who came to Bellewood Academy hungry for knowledge, in the teachers who risked their safety to provide education, in the freedmen who built businesses and communities despite facing obstacles designed to ensure their failure, in the white allies who stood beside them, who risked social ostracism and sometimes violence to support justice. These were small lights in a great darkness, but Thomas learned to see them, to appreciate them, to nurture them. Thomas Cole died on May 17, 1905, 66 years to the day after Sarah's recorded death. He was 83 years old, an remarkable age for a man who had lived the life he'd lived. He died in his sleep, peacefully according to the doctor who examined him, and that peace was perhaps the final evidence that revenge, however justified, however complete, is not the same as redemption. But this is where the story should end, with Thomas's death and the school he built, and the suggestion that something good emerged from tragedy. Except that would be a lie, because the story doesn't end. It never ended. And what Thomas didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that he had only destroyed the visible part of the network. The experiments didn't stop with Dr. Hunt's death or Dr. Marchand's arrest or the burning of the sanitarium. They continued. They evolved. They became more sophisticated, more hidden, more protected, by layers of institutional authority that made them almost impossible to trace. In 1897, a private hospital opened in Memphis, funded by a charitable foundation established by families that had once been part of the network Thomas had tried to destroy. The hospital specialized in maternal health, offering free care to poor women, colored and white, who couldn't afford private physicians. It was praised for its charity work, its dedication to reducing maternal mortality, its modern facilities, and well-trained staff. But in the hospital's basement, in examination rooms that required special keys to access, the experiments continued. Doctors working there conducted research that would have been familiar to Dr. Hunt and Dr. Marchand. They tested new surgical techniques on women who didn't fully understand what was being done to them. They administered experimental drugs to pregnant patients without their informed consent. They kept detailed records of outcomes, publishing findings in medical journals under oblique language about advancing maternal care and improving obstetric outcomes. This hospital still exists. Its name has changed, its funding sources have been laundered through multiple foundations, but the building remains. The basement examination rooms are still there, though they're locked now, supposedly for safety reasons related to asbestos or structural concerns. The current staff doesn't know what happened in those rooms, or if they do know, they've been instructed not to speak about it. History, when it's inconvenient, can be buried as effectively as bodies. And the hospital in Memphis was just one continuation. There were others. A research facility in Georgia that operated under the guise of studying sickle cell anemia. A clinic in Alabama that offered free health services to poor women while conducting unauthorized sterilizations. A hospital in North Carolina that maintained a eugenics program well into the 1970s. These weren't random acts of cruelty. They were connected, part of an ongoing project that began with people like Dr. Hunt and Dr. Marchand, people who believed that certain lives were worth less than others, that those lives could be used as raw material for advancing medical knowledge and social engineering. You can trace the lineage if you know where to look. The doctors who trained under Dr. Hunt's colleagues went on to establish their own practices and research programs. They trained other doctors, who trained others, creating a genealogy of medical abuse that spread through the American healthcare system like a disease. The names changed. The language became more technical, more carefully vetted by lawyers and institutional review boards. But the fundamental belief remained that some people's bodies are resources to be exploited in the service of progress. The Tuskegee syphilis study, which ran from 1932 to 1972, was part of this lineage. Researchers deliberately withheld treatment from infected black men to study the disease's progression. Even after penicillin became available as a cure, the men weren't told they had syphilis. They were told they were receiving free health care for bad blood. They were human experiments, just like the women in Dr. Hunt's cellar, and the justification was the same. Advancing medical knowledge required sacrifice, and certain people could be sacrificed without moral consequence. The forced sterilization programs that operated in 32 states between 1907 and the 1980s were part of this lineage. Over 60,000 Americans were sterilized without their consent, deemed unfit to reproduce based on eugenicist theories that grew from the same root as Dr. Hunt's experiments. The victims were disproportionately poor, colored, disabled, or institutionalized. Their bodies were treated as problems to be solved, threats to be neutralized, experiments to be conducted. The radiation experiments conducted on unwitting subjects during the Cold War were part of this lineage. Prisoners, hospital patients, pregnant women, and children were exposed to dangerous levels of radiation to study its effects on the human body. Many of them were never told what was being done to them, Many died from cancers and illnesses directly caused by the experiments. The justification was national security, the need to understand radiation's effects for military purposes. But the underlying logic was identical to what Dr. Hunt practiced. Certain lives matter less, and those lives can be used without their consent for supposedly greater purposes. This pattern continues into the present day. Medical racism hasn't disappeared. It's evolved. Black women in America are 3 to 4 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related complications than white women, a disparity that persists across all income and education levels. This isn't accidental. It's the result of systemic biases in healthcare, the assumption that black women's pain isn't as real or urgent as white women's pain, the legacy of medical experimentation that treated black bodies as inherently different and less worthy of care. Stories emerge periodically about modern abuses. Women in immigration detention centers undergoing unnecessary hysterectomies. Incarcerated women being sterilized without proper consent. Impoverished communities being used as testing grounds for new pharmaceuticals without adequate safety protocols. Each revelation is treated as an isolated incident, a bad actor or institutional failure, rather than what it actually is. The continuation of a system that began in places like the cellar beneath Bellewood Manor. Thomas Cole couldn't have known this. He died believing he had destroyed the network, that his 30-year campaign of revenge had accomplished something meaningful. He never knew that what he fought was larger than any individual or family, that it was woven into the institutions and ideologies that governed American society. He sealed one examination room, but thousands of others remained, their doors locked, their secrets protected by the same forces that had protected the Whitmores. But perhaps Thomas understood something more fundamental. Perhaps he recognized in those final years when he ran the school rather than pursuing revenge, that the real battle wasn't against individuals or even networks. It was against the idea that some lives are expendable, and that battle couldn't be won through violence or revenge. It could only be won through education, through building institutions that valued all lives equally, through creating communities that refused to accept the logic of expendability. The Bellewood Academy closed in 1905, the same year Thomas died. Without his funding and leadership, the school couldn't sustain itself against the mounting pressure from white supremacist groups who had never accepted its existence. The building was sold to a private owner who converted it back into a residence. It changed hands several times over the decades, and each owner reported the same problems. Strange noises in the night, a smell that couldn't be located or eliminated, a sense of unease that made the house feel wrong somehow. In 1968, during renovations to modernize the plumbing, workers broke through a brick wall in the cellar. They found the examination room, still sealed after more than a century. The medical equipment was rusted and decayed, but recognizable. The jars were gone. Thomas had destroyed those, but the journals remained, hidden in a sealed cabinet that Thomas had never found. The tally marks and scratched prayers were still visible on the walls. The workers called the police. An investigation was opened, but it quickly dead-ended. The journals documented crimes committed over a century ago by people who were long dead. The victims were unnamed in official records, women who had disappeared or died without investigation, in an era when such things weren't investigated, if they involved the right kind of victim. There was no one to prosecute, no justice to be served through legal channels. The house was condemned. The examination room was documented by forensic specialists and historians, photographed and measured and cataloged. Then it was sealed again, this time with concrete rather than brick. The house itself was demolished in 1970, and the land was sold to a developer who built a shopping center on the site. There's a pharmacy there now, appropriately enough, built directly over where the examination room used to be. The people who fill their prescriptions there have no idea what happened beneath their feet. But the story survived. Thomas's own journals were discovered in 1983, stored in a trunk in the basement of a church that had taken over Bellewood Academy's library collection. A historian researching the Reconstruction era found them and recognized their significance. The journals documented Thomas's campaign against the Whitmores and the network, his methodical destruction of the families and institutions responsible for his sister's death. They also documented his later work with the school, his evolution from vengeful destroyer to builder and educator. The journals were published in edited form in 1991 as part of a scholarly work on resistance to slavery and medical racism. The reviewer in the American Historical Review called them a remarkable document of one man's pursuit of justice in an unjust system, but noted that many of Cole's claims about a broader network of medical experimentation remain unverified and possibly exaggerated. But were they exaggerated? Researchers following up on Thomas's documentation began finding corroborating evidence. Medical journals from the 1820s through the 1860s contained articles about obstetric research that matched Thomas's descriptions. Property records confirmed that the families he named owned estates with unusually large cellars or outbuildings described as medical facilities. Death records showed patterns of young women dying from fever or childbed complications at rates significantly higher than average in counties where these families lived. A forensic archaeologist excavated the woods behind what had been Bellewood Manor in 1998, searching for the graves where Thomas's men had buried the specimens from Dr. Hunt's examination room. She found 17 burial sites, each containing glass jars with preserved remains. DNA analysis was impossible due to degradation, but morphological examination confirmed they were human fetal remains, ranging from early to late-term development. Some showed evidence of abnormalities consistent with experimental manipulation or exposure to toxic substances. The discovery made regional news, but was quickly overshadowed by other stories. There was discussion of creating a memorial, but it never materialized. The property owner objected to having the land designated as a burial site. The remains were eventually reburied in a municipal cemetery in a collective grave marked with a simple stone that reads, "Unknown, 1820 to 1840. May they rest in peace." Sarah's grave, the one in the Whitmore family plot, was never disturbed. The cemetery where she was supposedly buried the second time still exists, now maintained by a historical preservation society. Tourists visit to see the elaborate Victorian monuments and read the epitaphs of Mississippi's old families. Sarah's headstone is small, easy to overlook among the grander markers, but occasionally someone stops to read it. Sarah Cole, 1823 to 1839, faithful servant, beloved child of God. They don't know that Sarah was never buried there, that her body remained in the examination room until Thomas sealed it, that she might still be there, beneath the pharmacy's foundation, beneath layers of concrete and time and deliberate forgetting. Or perhaps Thomas did move her in those 3 years he lived in Bellewood Manor, before he converted it into a school. Perhaps he found her remains and gave her a proper burial somewhere, a place he never documented because some acts are too private, too sacred to record. Thomas's own grave is in Natchez City Cemetery, in a section reserved for freedmen and their descendants. His headstone is larger than Sarah's, befitting his prominence in the community. It lists his birth and death dates, and beneath them, a single line: "He built a school." No mention of his revenge. No reference to his campaign against the Whitmores. Just the simple statement of what he chose to be remembered for. The act of building rather than destroying. But here's what you need to understand, what you need to carry with you now that you know this story. Thomas Cole's revenge was complete and utterly insufficient. He destroyed the people who killed his sister. He dismantled the network that enabled them. He exposed their crimes and made them pay with their fortunes, their freedom, and their lives. And none of it mattered, not in the way he hoped it would, because the system that made Sarah's death possible continued to function. It continues to function now. The cellars still exist, not literally perhaps, but functionally. They're called research facilities and medical centers and public health programs. And they still operate on the principle that certain bodies are expendable in the service of progress. The Dr. Hunts still exist, wearing different names and using different justifications, but practicing the same fundamental logic, that human beings can be reduced to experimental subjects if they lack sufficient social power to refuse. And the Sarah Coles still exist. Women who are used and discarded, whose deaths are attributed to natural causes or inevitable complications, who are erased from official narratives, whose suffering is treated as the unfortunate but necessary cost of advancing knowledge. There's still pregnant teenagers dying in locked rooms. There's still poor women whose bodies are sites of experimentation. They're still considered expendable. Thomas understood in the end that you can't revenge your way to justice. You can kill the individuals, but you can't kill the system that creates them. You can destroy the institutions, but you can't destroy the ideologies that justify them. The only thing you can do is build something better and hope it survives long enough to change the world that created the horror. The Bellewood Academy lasted 37 years. That's not very long in historical terms, but it's 2 generations. 2 generations of children who learned to read and write and think critically about the world they inherited. 2 generations who learned that their lives had value, that their humanity was inherent rather than granted by others, that they deserved education and opportunity and justice. Some of those children became the civil rights activists of the 1960s. Some became the doctors and lawyers and teachers who dismantled legal segregation and fought for equality. Some are still alive, elderly now, telling their grandchildren about the school where a man named Thomas Cole taught them that revenge is empty, but education is power. So maybe Thomas's revenge wasn't complete, but it wasn't utterly insufficient either. Maybe it was the beginning of something, the first strike against a system that relied on people accepting their own expendability. Maybe every act of resistance, no matter how violent or how futile it seems, contributes to an eventual transformation. Or maybe that's just a comforting story we tell ourselves, because the truth, that Sarah Cole died screaming in a cellar and nothing we do can make that right, is too terrible to bear. You know the story now. You know what happened in the cellars beneath the great houses. You know that the network wasn't destroyed, only transformed. You know that the experiments continue in different forms, under different justifications, targeting different populations but following the same logic. And you know that Thomas Cole spent 30 years seeking revenge and found only emptiness, spent his final decades building a school and found something closer to meaning. What you do with this knowledge is your choice. You can file it away as historical curiosity, a dark chapter in the past that has nothing to do with the present. You can tell yourself that things are different now, that we've learned from our mistakes, that institutional review boards and human rights laws prevent the kind of abuses that happened at Bellewood Manor. You can believe that Sarah Cole's death mattered only to her brother and has no implications for how medicine and power operate today. Or you can recognize that Sarah Cole is still dying, over and over, in hospitals and clinics and research facilities, wherever bodies are treated as resources rather than people. You can see the pattern that Thomas saw, the connection between the examination room beneath Bellewood Manor and the modern medical system's treatment of marginalized populations. You can understand that the war Thomas fought isn't over, that it's never been over, that every generation has to fight it again in new forms. The pharmacy built over Sarah's grave is open 24 hours. People go there at 3 a.m. when they're sick or hurt or desperate, and they trust that the people behind the counter will help them, that the medications they receive are safe, that the system has their best interests at heart. Most of the time that trust is warranted. But sometimes it isn't. Sometimes the system still operates on the principle that certain lives are worth less than others, that certain bodies can be used without full consent, that progress requires sacrifice, and the people doing the sacrificing are always drawn from the same populations. Thomas Cole couldn't fix that. He tried, through revenge and then through education, and he failed. But he also succeeded, because he refused to accept that Sarah's death was acceptable, that it could be dismissed as the price of progress or the inevitable result of social hierarchy. He insisted that her life mattered, that her death required a response, that someone had to remember and someone had to act. He was just one man with no power and no resources, and he nearly destroyed a network that had operated with impunity for decades. He didn't finish the job, but he proved it could be fought. That's what you carry now, the knowledge that resistance is possible even when it seems futile. The understanding that systems of power rely on people accepting their own powerlessness. The awareness that every Sarah Cole deserves a Thomas Cole, someone who refuses to forget, someone who insists that expendability is not acceptable, someone who will spend their life fighting against the machinery that grinds people into material for progress. You're part of this story now, whether you wanted to be or not. You know what happened in the cellar beneath Bellewood Manor. You know it's still happening. You know that pharmacy sits on a grave, and that everyone who shops there walks over the place where women died so that doctors could advance their knowledge. And knowledge is burden, and knowledge is power, and what you do with it determines whether Thomas Cole's revenge meant anything at all. Will you seal it away like Thomas sealed the examination room? Will you try to forget, to move on, to treat it as historical curiosity? Or will you do what Thomas did, what Sarah would have wanted, what all the women scratched their prayers for while dying in locked rooms? Remember, insist, refuse to accept that any of this was acceptable, and build something better from the ruins. The pharmacy built over Sarah's grave is sealed beneath concrete and time, but it's not gone. Nothing is ever really gone. The tally marks are still scratched into the stone. The names are still there, waiting. Sarah Cole is still waiting, beneath the pharmacy, beneath the shopping center, beneath the comfortable fiction that these things happened in the past and have no connection to the present. She's still waiting for someone to remember, someone to care, someone to insist that her life mattered, and her death requires more than a sealed room and deliberate forgetting. Thomas remembered. He cared. He insisted. For 30 years he pursued revenge, and for 20 more he built a school, and neither approach was sufficient, but both were necessary. He died believing he'd failed, but his journals survived, and his documentation survived, and the story survived, passed down through generations until it reached you. Now it's yours. The story of Sarah Cole and Thomas Cole, and the cellar beneath Bellewood Manor. The story of the network that turned women into experiments and lives into data. The story of one man's insufficient, necessary, complete, and futile attempt to make the world acknowledge what it had done. The story that never ends because the system that created it never ends. It only evolves, adapts, finds new forms and new justifications for the same ancient logic. That some people matter less, that some bodies can be used, that progress requires sacrifice, and the powerful get to decide who gets sacrificed. You know now, you're complicit now, you're part of it, and the only question that matters is what you're going to do with that knowledge. Will you seal it away like Thomas sealed the examination room? Will you try to forget, to move on, to treat it as historical curiosity? Or will you do what Thomas did, what Sarah would have wanted, what all the women scratched their prayers for while dying in locked rooms? Remember, insist, refuse to accept that any of this was acceptable, and build something better from the ruins. The pharmacy is open, the shopping center is busy, the concrete is thick and solid. But beneath it all, Sarah is still waiting. 19 women are still waiting. The tally marks are still counting. And somewhere, in a cellar or laboratory or medical facility that looks nothing like Bellewood Manor, but functions on the same principles, another Sarah Cole is dying, while the world decides her life is expendable. You can't save her, neither could Thomas. But you can remember her. You can insist she mattered. You can refuse to accept the logic that made her death acceptable. That's all Thomas could do, and he did it, and maybe that's enough. Maybe remembering is its own form of resistance. Maybe insisting is its own form of justice. Maybe refusing to forget is the only revenge that matters, the only thing that stops the tally marks from climbing higher, the only way to honor the dead and protect the living. Remember Sarah Cole. Remember what they did to her. Remember that it's still happening, and decide what you're going to do about it.